Hi everybody, welcome to my top 10 albums of the 1960s. So far over the last few months I've done every decade from the 2000s back to what I'm doing now, and by the end of this year I'm going to do my top 10 albums of this particular decade that we're just finishing. But for today it's the 1960s. For those of you that know me, it's not going to come as a massive surprise that there's one band that does very, very well in this chart, but there's plenty of other stuff there too, including at number 10, I've got the Velvet Underground and Nico. This is an album that when I listen to it, I feel like I've been invited to the coolest 1960s party that's ever going to happen, and I feel like I'm there for it. It's great songs throughout, such as Sunday Morning, Femme Fatale, Venus in Furs, what a vibe that song's got. Run Run Run, All Tomorrow's Parties, Heroin, that's such an intense song. And I love the sort of back end of the album as well, Black Angel's Death Song and European Sun. It's, a few years ago I did a sort of a listening session over the period of a few weeks where I put together this playlist right from the sort of dawn of rock and roll, with Rocky 88, Jackie Brenston from the very early 50s, and I did it right through to the sort of early 70s, and I listened chronologically to see how music developed over that period, and there were certain points where you just thought, wow, something new's happened here. I've never heard anything like this before. This was absolutely one of those for me when I did that session that lasted me a few weeks. Nothing like this had come before. One of the great albums to come out of America in the 1960s, I would say. And probably a sort of a rare one. A lot of the great albums from America at that time would have featured the Wrecking Crew, that fantastic session band. But this is something different to that. This is aside from that great scene that was going on there. Wonderful album, still sounds great today. Velvet Underground and Nico at number 10. At number 9, I'm going to show my appreciation here for British folk rock with Fairport Convention's Leash and Leaf. Wonderful album this. It was born of tragedy, recorded in 1969, just after they'd had a bus crash that killed their drummer Martin Lamble, and then shortly afterwards they carried on and made this album. So it's there's sort of an unfortunate story behind this, but it's great songs. Come All Ye, Rainadine, and Matty Groves. It's a great opening 3 songs to this album. And for British folk rock, I think this is the pinnacle. For me, Sandy Denny's on absolutely top form. Of course, a couple of years later, she'd be working with Led Zeppelin. And I've got a big interest in Sandy Denny's career around about this time, and into us when she worked with Fotheringay after this and a solo career. But this is probably up there for me as the sort of peak of her career. It's a wonderful album. That's my number 9, Leash and Leaf. At number 8, it's somebody who was in a similar sort of scene to Fairport Convention. He was certainly around in the same kind of places at the same time. Nick Drake with 5 Leaves Left. This is his debut album from 1969. The first of his 3 studio albums. It's absolutely wonderful. It's mainly him and a guitar, a little bit of orchestration here and there, and the odd flute. But other than that, what shines through is his voice and his guitar playing. He was an absolute genius. I talked about that on my 1970s albums ranking. He was no less of a force in the late 60s. Even though hardly anybody got to hear this album at the time, hardly anybody bought it, very few people saw him in concert. He was a very reluctant live performer, and he soon withdrew from performing live. So there's very few people really that have got stories to tell about having seen him perform. But just such a genius in my eyes. And number 8, that's Nick Drake, 5 Leaves Left. At number 7, we can't keep them down forever. They're finally here. It's Rubber Soul by the Beatles. There's not a great deal I can say about this album that you've probably not heard a million times before, and I've talked about it at length recently on a video that I did exclusively about this album. But this is the transition from moving away from pop, which they'd been sort of up to help, moving into something a bit more arty, a bit more thoughtful. This was the start of their sort of classic run of albums that went right through the sort of next however many albums it was that they made after this. But from the cover to the music that's in it, everything about it is wonderful. That's my number 7 album, Rubber Soul. At number 6, I'm not sure if I can express how much I love this album, but it's Ogden's Nut Gone Flake by the Small Faces. Now, if I had one wish for this video, if there was one person who watched it and thought, I've never heard that, I think I'll give it a go, that would be superb if that happened. It shows how they were one of the great bands of the era, from the sort of opening psychedelic keyboard piece, the title track to the album that starts the album, and then it goes into Afterglow, and Steve Marriott starts singing quite laid back at first, and then bang, he goes for it, and you realise why he's one of the great singers that Britain's ever produced. And then the Song of a Baker, which is a sort of an ode to making bread, and how that can be something that you can have a passion for, where he sings about sort of having wheat in the fields and an aching in me. And you just think, it's great when people have a passion for something that they love, and is expressing it as well as pretty much any love song that you've ever heard, but it's a love for making bread. It's fantastic. And then at the end of side 1, this is very much an album of two halves, as much as any album ever. At the end of side 1, Lazy Sunday, which I think it was very high in the charts in the UK. I'm not sure if it got to number 1, but it's the sort of comical, lovely jabbly cockney romp. And at the end of it, it to me sort of signals in what's going to happen in side 2. So at the end of the song, he falls asleep. He goes to the toilet, basically, and he's sort of looking up at the stars, and he sort of drifts away. And then side 2 starts, and for me, I've always felt that the start of side 2 is him having fallen asleep at the end of Lazy Sunday, and this is the dream that he has. And this is where it sets this album apart. Side 2 is crazy. I absolutely love it. So Professor Stanley Unwin, if you've never heard of him, he was I guess he was a comedian, and he spoke a language called gobbledygook.
High wall, city, country bowl, 2 square on your body. Then I'll begin.
And he narrates side 2. He narrates each song, the story that's been had in the dream, and basically it's the story of there being it going from a full moon to a half moon, and a character called Happiness Stan is going to go and look for the disappearing half of the moon, and it plays out like a children's story, but with great rock songs. And they're very cunningly, they rip a few riffs off in it, which is really good. There's a little bit of Hendrix in there, there's a bit of Beatles in there, but it's great rock songs telling a childlike story, all narrated like a children's book would be, and it's just glorious. I absolutely love it. That's my number 6 anyway, Ogden's Nut Gone Flake. Okay, at number 5. So I mentioned earlier with Velvet Underground and Nico how I did that chronological listening session, and that album was something new, something that you'd not heard before. It's exactly the same with this at number 5. It's the Beatles, it's Revolver. And with songs like Tomorrow Never Knows, they were pushing the boundaries of what pop music could be. It still sounds a bit futuristic today. It sounds like something that might have influenced, let's say, the Chemical Brothers 30 years later. It's got Paul McCartney becoming one of the great songwriters of all time with songs like Eleanor Rigby, Here, There and Everywhere, For No One. John Lennon on fantastic psychedelic form. I mentioned obviously about Tomorrow Never Knows, but She Said, and I'm Only Sleeping. Wonderful songs. George is starting to get into his stride with Taxman, Love You Too, I Want to Tell You. And it's got Ringo's classic contribution written by Paul, Yellow Submarine, one of the more famous Beatles songs. So yeah, they were really pushing the boundaries by this time. It's a stunning album, still sounds amazing today. That's my number 5, Revolver by the Beatles. Okay, at number 4. In my book, if you're the number 4 album of the 1960s, you're not far off being the number 4 album of all time, which sounds fair to me for the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. Incredible album. Brian Wilson, I think, is one of the greatest geniuses of all time in music. This was very much at the period where he was trying to him and the Beatles were trying to push each other. Very friendly rivalry, but the Beatles wanted to outdo the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson wanted to outdo the Beatles, and they were pushing themselves to incredible heights. This album was very different in terms of Brian had quit touring by this point. The band had gone off on a tour. When he came back, Brian had pretty much made the album, the instrumental basis of the album anyway, with the Wrecking Crew, that fantastic session band. And then the Beach Boys added their lyrics to it. They were concerned. They didn't think that this was going to be a success because it was veering away from that surf music that they'd been known for. I think Mike Love especially was very wary of it, but Brian Wilson knows better than Mike Love, thankfully. Such amazing songs on this. Wouldn't it be nice? You Still Believe in Me. Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulders. Beautiful. Sloop John B, which I think was recorded earlier than the rest of the songs, and some people aren't as keen on that. I absolutely love Sloop John B. And it's one of my highlights of the album, to be honest, that when the backing vocals kick in, it's just absolutely glorious. God only knows, what can you say about that song other than it's one of the great songs of all time? And certainly Paul McCartney has often mentioned it as being one of his favourite songs of the popular music era ever. And, that man knows a tune. And it's fantastic all the way up to the end. It's just got great instrumentation because it was such a fantastic band that made this album. And when you couple a fantastic band with the amazing vocals that the Beach Boys could add to an album, and then combine that with Brian Wilson at his absolute peak as a songwriter, then you're in for something special, and this is something special. That's my number 4, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Okay, before we look at the top 3, I'm just going to show you the shortlist. As I always do, these are the albums that are considered for the top 10 but didn't quite make the cut. And it's dominated by, there's plenty of Bob Dylan in there, there's plenty of the Beatles in there, Simon and Garfunkel bookends, Forever Changes by Love, and the Christmas album from Phil Spector, Christmas Gift for You, featuring various bands that he was working with at the time. Just some of my favourite Christmas songs on there. So yeah, there's the shortlist, and now let's crack on with the top 3. To be honest, most of the top 5 or 6 could be in any order, but I've gone with number 3. I've gone with Abbey Road by the Beatles from 1969, the last album that they recorded, even though they released Let It Be the following year. And it's the story's been told so many times, so I'm not going to go into massive depth, but they really did come back and put all their efforts into one incredible final album. It's legendary throughout, really, with starting off with Come Together, John's great song there. I regard side 2 of Abbey Road as probably the best thing that's ever been put on record, as far as I'm concerned. That medley, just sensational all the way through. Each individual song might not be the greatest song you've ever heard. I mean, I don't think there'll be many people saying, Mean Mr. Mustard is my favourite song of all time, or Polythene Pan, but when you put them together in that medley, it just works brilliantly. The Beatles knew how to make the best of the songs that they had available to them. It's a classic cover, it's a classic back, everything about it screams classic. It's a wonderful way to end the Beatles' career. That's Abbey Road. At number 2, I am not going to make any apologies for the fact that it's them again. It's the Beatles. It's the White Album from 1968. This, to me, is, if you were to ask me that question about, you're going to be stuck on a desert island for the rest of your life, there's going to be a record player there, you can take one album with you, what are you going to take? I am going to take this with me, because this just covers all the range of songs that I need. If I want hard rock, I've got Helter Skelter. If I want something gentle and acoustic to sit under a palm tree, I've got Mother Nature's Son. I've got music hall. There's avant-garde with Revolution 9. There's a Beach Boys pastiche with Back in the USSR. It's just got everything that I want on this album. And the emotions that you go through, especially in the second half of the album, where the White Album for me should take me to a dark place in that final third. And this does. It's one of my absolute favourite albums of all time, and it would have to be for it to be number 2 on my 60s list. That's the White Album by the Beatles. Okay, we've finally reached the number 1 spot, and here it is. Cheers. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. For me, it's the greatest album that's ever been made. Pound for pound, if you look at achievements that albums are based on the technology that's available to them, I don't think anything's ever come close to this. To record this on a 4-track recording machine, it blows my mind now to think of it. They were at the peak of the creativity. There's a great book that tells the story of the Beatles in 1966. I read it about a year ago, and how they became what they were during Sgt. Pepper as a result of what happened to them during 1966. And when you learn about everything that they were going through, they were leading the world by this point in music, without a shadow of a doubt. Absolutely stunning achievement. And I've not even mentioned any of the songs yet. Obviously the title track, With a Little Help from My Friends, great opening. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, magnificent psychedelic song. There's Getting Better, which is one of my favourite Beatles songs. Probably not one that would feature for everybody, but it's always a song that I've absolutely adored. I love the music, all kind of stuff that's there with When I'm 64, and George's With You Without You, showing that Indian side of the music, probably the best example of that they ever did. And then the end of the album, A Day in the Life, just what a song that is, what an achievement to even just come up with a song like that, and for John and Paul to build their portions of songs together in that way was absolutely fantastic. There's so much packed into this album. I could never ever get bored of it. I could never get bored of that cover and the impact that it had on the world. It's probably had more impact on release than any other album in history, I would suggest. You know, I wasn't there back then when it came out, so for those of you that were, and those of you that remember it coming out, I'd certainly love to hear your stories on that. But I have a lot of admiration and for the people who went through that, because that must have been a fantastic time to live through. But anyway, that's my top 10 albums of the 1960s. Very much shaped by my taste in music, but of course it would be. Why on earth wouldn't it be? I don't apologise for the Beatles featuring heavily. They were the best band of the 60s. But thank you very much for watching. Love to hear your comments as always. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks very much. I'll see you next time.